Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics. So yesterday there were two massive resignations from the BBC after accusations of bias in their reporting. Now, what were your initial thoughts on the news that Tim Davie, Director General, had resigned? Relief that Labour will be able to replace one of Boris Johnson's Tory plants in the BBC? Or, like me, concern about the circumstances and where it might lead? Let me know in the comments below. But I'm going to say, as I've just alluded to there, I am conflicted. But before I go over the circumstances and discuss my hesitation in welcoming the news, even though Davie is someone I think has done immense harm to the BBC's reputation and thoroughly deserves to be gone, I want to say something about the BBC in general. We need it. Let's split up the BBC into its news and everything else. The everything else is huge. News is only a very, very small part of the operations. The everything else is very, very good. The BBC projects a positive image of Britain around the world. Even in the UK, it's a major employer within the creative arts sector. It supports British artistic culture and it does it very well. If the BBC were to be broken up and privatised, we'd lose it all. The only things which would be produced by a private alternative would be what is overwhelmingly profitable and what's useful for promoting very right-wing views amongst the public. The soft power globally, that would be gone. The employment within the creative arts industry, that would be massively cut back. The BBC falling should be the stuff of nightmares for anyone who is socially progressive or left-wing, despite the obvious failures of their news programming. I'll also just reflect on the words of Deborah Turnus, the CEO of News and Current Affairs, who's also resigned. Now, she hasn't really popped up as a particular problem when we've been discussing BBC bias in the past. But at the end of the day, she's the CEO of the News and Current Affairs part, which is the part that has the problem. So she clearly hasn't done her job well either. But she insisted that although mistakes were made, there was no institutional bias within the BBC. I think she's telling the truth. There is bias within the BBC, within the News and Current Affairs programming. But I have often had the impression, going back years, that it's not institutionally intended. Let me use a couple of examples of BBC bias to illustrate my point. The first is the very famous bias during the Brexit years. After leaving the BBC, Emily Maitlis explained that the BBC would find an economist to speak against Brexit within a few moments, and then it would take them hours to find an economist to talk about the benefits. This is because economists knew that Brexit would be a disaster. There were literally a handful who were either knowing grifters or just so politically extreme in their views that they would be able to claim, oh, it'll work out, don't worry about it. Spoiler, they were all powerfully wrong and the vast majority of economists were spot on. So the BBC would present to the public one pro-Brexit economist and one anti-Brexit economist, and the public would naturally assume that opinion was divided amongst the experts, so they'll have to work it out themselves. No, it wasn't. However, you can see this from the BBC's point of view. Those privately educated chinless wonders thought that they were running a debate. Oh, it's a debate, innit? It's a public debate. And in a debate, you have opposing sides. That was their mistake. It was the politicians running the debate. It was the job of the BBC to present the facts, not the opinions. But it was still a mistake. You can see how people would think getting someone from each side would be avoiding bias. It's wrong, but innocent. There was no deliberate attempt to be pro-Brexit. Then another form of bias, which continues today, discussing the main political issues of the day. The BBC get on people to talk about them. Almost all of them are people from right-wing lobby groups like the IEA or like the Heritage Foundation now. They're presented as economists or some other profession. They're not. By contrast, it's much rarer to get someone from a left-wing lobby group. Not unheard of, but much rarer. But even that's unintentional bias. How does it happen? Are the BBC going around, oh, we want someone from the IEA or we want someone that's right-wing? No, they just want someone who can discuss the matters plausibly on their shows. They just need someone to get on their show and talk about it in a way that doesn't embarrass them. And the right-wing lobby groups have loads of money. They pay people to be constantly letting the BBC and other outlets know, I've got someone who can jump on your show at a moment's notice. Left-wing or socially progressive lobby groups, first of all, there's not as many of them. And second, they don't have this well-funded network pushing their own advocates. It's still bias, and it's bias that shouldn't happen. But I think it's just the nature of the beast, not intentional. Whereas if the BBC were to fall and BBC News and the other parts privatised, the new owners would be intentionally biased. I've said it before and I'll say it again. The BBC, with all its faults, is way better than anything that would realistically replace it. The call has to be for reform, not privatising it. In fact, regardless of its fault, my mind boggles whenever I see someone who says they're left-wing calling for our public broadcaster to be privatised. Give your head a wobble, will you? But anyway, that out of the way, there are individuals within the BBC who are personally biased, and there are examples of that. But anyway, come to that in a moment. What about the resignations? I have no specific beef with Turner as a person, other than the fact she was in a position to tackle even unintentional bias in reporting and failed to do so. You know, it was her job to stop this and she didn't. Tim Davie was a more distant figure from the news because he's like the Director General of like the whole thing. But he was also still useless. He was also politically connected. You know, there shouldn't be overt political appointments to the BBC. I mean, if you put right-wing people into all of the key positions in the BBC, then even without any explicit corruption, you're going to get that bias. Such as, for example, the famous image of Jeremy Corbyn with a Moscow background on Newsnight that time. Someone made that decision. That was an example of deliberate political bias. There was no great fuss made by the right-wing media then, was there, though, about bias? No. In fact, when complaints came in, the BBC told those taking issue to piss off. And then we had, after Brexit, we had the famous case of someone being interviewed about the post, when we left the single market, the post-Brexit trading relations, and they edited out reference to Brexit. I think it was a fishmonger or something. So that was, again, a deliberate attempt to conceal something from the public. So you do get individuals who are personally biased. But institutionally, the wider examples of bias, not the specific ones, you can actually put down to just the way their guidelines are. And this is what makes these resignations really concerning for me. Yes, those people did not do their jobs properly. They've presided over a reputational hit to the BBC, but for the opposite reasons to the truth. They folded because of pressure from the Tory client media, spearheaded by The Telegraph, Boris Johnson, claiming the BBC has a pro-left and pro-liberal bias. I mean to say. Those people have resigned over accusations of bias in the opposite direction. And that's what concerns me. The specific issues were a BBC programme which selectively edited comments from Trump to make it look like he was encouraging the January 6th Capitol Hill insurrection. Now, we know he was. But stitching together lines that he said an hour apart to make it look like it was one statement. That is dirty. We see it all too often from the gutter press behind these resignations. But the BBC, as a publicly funded outlet, should not. Actually, no outlet should pull stunts like that, but certainly not the BBC. So obviously that was serious. Not just because it's misrepresenting the current US president, serious enough, but because it was actually an attempt to mislead the public. Shouldn't do things like that. The problem is that all the furore in the press was based on a leaked memo written by someone who claims to be independent, but is in fact a right-wing political activist. And the proof of that is that every single one of his numerous complaints about BBC coverage, which extends well beyond the Trump thing, is about coverage which casts a right-wing figure or cause in a negative light, whether fairly or not. Not a single issue with bias, unintentional or otherwise, for a left-wing or liberal issue or person. Someone who was genuinely independent would have found examples both ways, because there are plenty. It's also been suggested that Boris Johnson, who appointed the author of the memo, Michael Prescott, was behind the leak. After all, Davies certainly didn't leak the memo which led to his downfall. What's happening here is that not for the first time, the Tory client media have gone after someone and forced their resignation. I doubt they even believe that the resignation would come of it. That's not their aim. Their aim was just to persuade people that the BBC have got a left-wing liberal bias. Their objective was simply to get people to mistrust the BBC so that people would be more likely to then turn to their deliberate lies for the news. After all, if you don't trust the BBC, you still want news, you're going to get it somewhere else, right? The resignations are a bonus because it adds greater weight to their claims. Mind you, you could argue it also represents an opportunity. If they can be replaced by people who are scrupulously objective and above all competent, then the resignations could allow the BBC to make changes and restore the trust that's been lost. But will those changes be good or worse? If, for example, we allow ourselves some unicorn thinking and imagine, okay, they'll get someone in, they'll have tighter control over who is allowed to appear on their current affairs programmes, no more IEA, no more newspaper journalists, only qualified experts. Will the media then hold that up as evidence of left-wing bias driven by appointments from a Labour government? Is there any way in which the replacements even could deal with what I think is unintentional bias with reforms, which the rest of the media won't just paint as even worse bias, because after all, it will take away a lot of right-wing talking points from the BBC? I actually don't know. And that's why, although I shall shed no tears for the people who've resigned, because under other circumstances I'd have been delighted, they've caused a lot of damage, I worry about the specific reasons for their exits now. Is there a risk that this becomes a little bit like sacking Jimmy Savile as manager of the children's home and replacing him with Freddy Krueger instead? But let me know what you think in the comments below, and please subscribe to the channel for more content. Thanks for listening, and until next time, I'll see you later.